In this session, we're going to discuss why there is a sequence in the fossil record. Why is it that at the lower part of the fossil record you have mostly invertebrates, mostly marine organisms, and they change as you go up to the top? There are two primary alternative explanations of this. One, the fossil record was formed in the global flood. The second one is it's a record of evolution through millions of years. But if number one is the correct one, that it's formed in the global flood, why are the animals in that sequence? There's a theory called ecological zonation, which is the beginning of an explanation. In this slide, the middle part is a reconstruction of what the pre-flood Earth may have looked like. Then on the right, we will have the accumulating fossil record, and the arrow shows animals being killed at the bottom there of that landscape and deposited over in the fossil record. So you have one life zone that's getting destroyed and buried in the fossil record. Okay, now that first pre-flood habitat has been destroyed, and those have been buried, and now we're killing another set of organisms and burying them in the fossil record. And this continues. Now we've destroyed those first two pre-flood habitats, and we're carrying animals from the next part of the landscape and burying those in the fossil record. And this continues one habitat after another. There is a question of why in this lower part of the fossil record we don't have any humans or any elephants or any horses. After all, they were created during Creation Week. Well, our explanation will be that on the left part of the diagram you see animals portrayed that must have been alive at these different stages of the flood, but they were not in the areas where fossils were forming. So they did not get buried with these fish. The first creatures in the fossil record are marine, because that was the first habitats that were destroyed, the marine habitats. Okay, now we come up to the blue arrow in the Mesozoic, when Mesozoic creatures were being killed and carried over and buried in the fossil record. Now we get up to the higher parts of the record where we may have been establishing new post-flood habitats. The flood is ending at some point here, so some of these may have been animals actually living after the flood. Then the next part, certainly we now are burying creatures that lived after the flood. So to summarize this, at each stage of the flood, you have creatures being carried from a particular habitat and killed. And then that habitat's destroyed, and then you get to take the next habitat and the next one, and so on until you're finally now killing animals that were living after the flood and burying them. Now, have we answered all of the questions? No, certainly not. This is a good beginning, but there have to be other important factors that influence when an animal becomes a fossil. And here's a diagram that will illustrate that. When in a flood does an animal first get killed and buried? That's what is represented in this diagram. And so the number one indicates early death and burial. Now these three factors that we'll discuss. One of is ecology. We have here two ecological situations, creatures living down by the ocean and those living up in the mountains. Which one's going to get killed first in the flood? Well, certainly the one living in the ocean will get killed first before the one living up in the higher elevations. Now consider behavior. Of these two animals, which one will have behavior that's more likely to help it to survive longer in the flood? Well, salamanders and other creatures do not have the kind of behavior that would help them to survive longer during the flood. And in particular, think of some fish living in a lower part of the ocean. Well, how are they going to respond to some kind of a crisis, a problem? They're probably going to dive down to the bottom for protection. Well, that's not going to help them very well during the flood. And then different creatures differ greatly in their mobility. The little salamander does not have high mobility, whereas the bird can escape for a long time. And we add all these up, and they give us a mean of what we would expect to get killed first in the fossil record. The fish and the amphibians would be expected to get killed first, then reptiles, mammals, and birds later. There's one important thing to remember, and that is that we have never seen a global flood, so we don't know what would have happened during that event. And consequently, some of our questions will not be answered now. We can try to develop hypotheses of how we think it worked, but more study will give us more answers.